The military and political tensions of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union gave way to an era of enormous technological development. Traditional aircraft became inherently connected to the space race, and the increasing importance of warplanes that could quickly take off led to the creation of the first VTOLs, vehicles capable of hovering, taking off, and landing vertically. During the early 1950s, the Bell Aircraft Corporation produced the experimental X-14, one of the first trainer VTOLs in the U.S. Air Force. A modest and strange-looking vehicle built from spare parts, its objective was to study the versatility and reliability of vertical takeoff and landing aircraft that could transition to horizontal flight. The X-14 was eventually delivered to NASA to help astronauts train for landing maneuvers before the Apollo Lunar Module was developed, and even Neil Armstrong operated it in preparation for the groundbreaking mission that would take him to the moon. VTOL fighters. The Bell Aircraft Corporation patented a single-engine VTOL fighter with contra-rotating propellers in January of 1941. From then on and throughout World War II, the company spent considerable time developing the idea, but the technology of the era prevented engineers from exploiting the concept to its full potential. In addition, the design of their tactical VTOL, named Young's Convertiplane, never left the drawing boards due to insufficient jet engines in the World War II market. Supported by the Bureau of Aeronautics, Bell would go on to develop a new VTOL fighter in 1950. The project pitted it against competitors like the Lockheed XF-B1 and the Convair XF-Y1, but they were all cancelled shortly thereafter due to continuous malfunctions. Still, Bell kept privately working on a cheap VTOL concept, which they called the Air Test Vehicle, or ATV. This aircraft would go down in history as the Bell Model 65. Its airframe was manufactured with existing parts of other aircraft to reduce costs to a minimum. It was tested in late 1953 and managed to attract the attention of the U.S. Air Force. The following year, the ATV was severely damaged during a test flight, leading to its cancellation in 1955. The Model 65 was never able to transition from vertical to horizontal flight, but it showed considerable potential. Development. Fortunately for Bell, after the Model 65 cancellation, the U.S. Air Force was still interested in their research. A contract was issued to further develop the VTOL concept with a new testbed aircraft with improved capabilities. The contract established that Bell would build a low-cost vertical takeoff and landing flight demonstrator aircraft. This latest design would eventually become the Bell Model 68, or X-14. Designer M. McEwen and his small team worked so quickly in the development and assembly of the prototype that it was finished within 3 months. They needed to fulfill the deadline and low cost limit imposed by the U.S. Air Force, so the team was pragmatic when assembling the aircraft. The designers resorted to components from several existing aircraft to assemble their own. In his book Bell Aircraft Since 1935, author Alan G. Pelletier wrote that a civilian Beechcraft Model 35 Bonanza provided the wings, pouch for the undercarriage, and ailerons, while a Beechcraft T-34A Mentor military trainer provided the tail section. 2 British Armstrong Siddeley Viper AS-V8 turbojet engines with 7.8 kN thrust were mounted horizontally on the aircraft's center of gravity. And to save weight, no ejection seat was fitted. The X-14 was an open-concept mid-wing monoplane made up almost entirely of aluminum construction. Thrust diverters were mounted behind the engines to deflect jet thrust towards the ground during landing and takeoff. A pair of circular intakes took over most of the nose section of the fuselage, resembling a pig's nose. The fuel tanks were placed externally under each wing. The X-14 had a wingspan of 54 feet, a length of 26 feet, and an approximate height of 16 feet. Its maximum operating weight was 4,270 pounds. The final appearance of the X-14 was peculiar. It was not aesthetic, but it worked as a prototype. The aircraft could lift itself vertically off the ground by the direct jet lift, while the fuselage remained horizontal. At a considerable height, the X-14 was slightly deflected rearward to produce a forward thrust in addition to a jet lift. According to aviastar.org, quote, "When the forward speed was considered sufficient for the fixed wings to provide lift, all the thrust was directed aft, and the aircraft could fly in a conventional manner. During takeoff, landing, hovering, and flight at low speeds, directional control was effected by means of compressed air nozzles located at the wingtips and tail." Three flights. The X-14 was not tested until February 17, 1957, 18 months after the prototype was ready. Test pilot Dave Ho flew it at Bell's Niagara Falls installation. The first flight was merely vertical, and no attempt at transitioning to horizontal flight was performed due to safety reasons. Months later, in June of 1957, the first partial transition was attempted with remarkable success. It was followed almost 1 year later by the first full VTOL successful transition. Finally, the X-14 was delivered to the U.S. Air Force, which then shared it with NASA in 1959. Still, some adjustments were made to the aircraft following the data obtained from the first 3 flights. The initial X-14 landing gear configuration was too close to the ground, which led to a suck-down effect upon landing, pulling the aircraft down. This issue was resolved by lengthening the legs to absorb the impact after touchdown. Also, the original Armstrong Siddeley Viper 8 turbojets did not generate enough thrust to allow the aircraft to carry enough weight. The Vipers were replaced by 2 1,215 kg General Electric J85 JE5s, which effectively doubled the available thrust. Further tests performed at NASA's Ames Research Center in California found that the X-14 had a maximum speed of 172 miles per hour, a 300-mile range, and a service ceiling of 20,000 feet. By 1960, the X-14 was ready to serve in testing practices for astronauts preparing for future lunar landing maneuvers. NASA lunar testing. In February of 1963, NASA published a technical note titled "A Flight Evaluation of Lunar Landing Trajectories Using a Jet VTOL Test Vehicle." The article was a summary of various tests conducted with the X-14 to understand how it would compare to the Apollo's Lunar Module. The article read, quote, "A preliminary survey was made in a jet-propelled VTOL aircraft of the problems associated with performing lunar landing trajectories. The similarity of the lift and reaction type controls in a jet-supported VTOL aircraft and a lunar landing craft made the X-14A useful for this study. Several flight paths starting at an altitude of 1,000 feet and a 1-mile touchdown were explored. NASA wanted to test the best possible landing methods resembling how the aircraft would approach and land from a low altitude hovering above the lunar surface. The X-14 control system was similar to the one proposed for the Lunar Module, which helped NASA oversee how reliable the module would be for lunar operations. Trajectory, reliability, and fuel consumption were factors considered during testing. To realistically simulate potential lunar conditions, the X-14 was flown in smooth, calm air. All controls and inputs were accessible and responded well. Of the 5 trajectories flown by the test pilots, one of which was astronaut Neil Armstrong, the straight-line approach to the landing zone appeared to be the easiest to maneuver for an effective landing. According to the data gathered by NASA, this conclusion was reached out of 3 main reasons. Quote, "First, the constant angle approach makes it easier to detect deviations from the desired conditions. Second, fewer power and attitude adjustments are required, so that the maximum number of variables is held constant. Third, rates are easier to judge, and since the declination of the line of sight to the landing area from the horizon is small, the flight path is easy to maintain." Nevertheless, pilots were able to perform all trajectories without any problems. NASA concluded that the pilots could successfully perform the landing mission with, quote, "only visual and motion inputs, and to complete this task efficiently, he desires a field of view including both the prescribed touchdown point and the horizon." NASA would later release pictures to the media describing the tests conducted aboard the X-14. One of them said, quote, "In this photo, photographed by a Fairchild Flight Data Analyzer camera, the X-14A approaches its predetermined landing point from the right at an altitude of 1,000 feet. Vanes in the jet exhaust pipe are then turned to deflect the jet exhaust downward, allowing the aircraft to descend vertically to a soft landing. The forward motion in the latter half of the descent was the result of the pilot's controlled correction to assure landing on a predetermined point. The inset in the lower right-hand corner of the photo is a close-up of the Bell X-14A during descent. Armstrong would eventually land the Lunar Module in 1969 with remarkable success, just like he did during his training with the X-14. A stepping stone. NASA would continue to use the X-14 for training purposes for several years. In 1971, the aircraft was upgraded with new General Electric J85 JE19 engines and an onboard computer with a state-of-the-art control system. Many pilots and astronauts kept using the X-14 as a trainer until it was damaged beyond repair during an accident in May of 1981. The landing led to the collapse of the undercarriage and the rupture of one of the 2 fuel tanks, while the tail was almost entirely broken. The pilot, Ron Gerdes, survived without injuries. The X-14 was never rebuilt, and plans for designing upgraded versions were ditched. During its lifespan, more than 25 pilots flew it without any major accidents. More importantly, the X-14 provided the United States with an effective lunar orbiter training vehicle to replicate landing on the Moon, a revolutionary stepping stone to outer space.